the interlopers here. So welcome back. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Wasn't that an incredible first?
You have to give something extra here incidentally.
And did you notice the shirt? He definitely earned his Bethina shirt, and you can too. For just a few dollars, they have them out in the ragtime store, so you can look as good as Joshua Rifkin in your own Bethina shirt before this festival is over.
Sadly, I can't guarantee that it will make you able to play Bethina.
Well, thank you. Oh, so what we had in mind for the second half of the program is sort of an informal discussion with Joshua Rifkin, just to learn a bit more about his career, about his introduction to Scott Joplin. And as I said at the beginning of the program tonight, we do invite your questions as well. And so we're going to chat for maybe about 20 minutes, and then after that we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So be thinking of yours, jot them down, and we'll see how many we can get to. And I think the second half will run about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll call it a night. So that's sort of the running order, so why don't we get to it? And
I thought I'd lead off with just a few bullet points of some of the activities that I'm aware that Joshua had done prior to the release of the 1970 first of the three Joplin albums. So, from 1961 to 1964, he was a student at the Darmstadt School in Germany, which is a very avant-garde approach to music composition in Germany. In 1963, he was the vocalist and pianist and kazoo player in a jug band recording. In 1962, he sang the countertenor line in a cantata written by P.E.Q. Bach, Peter Schickele, before any Peter Schickele albums had ever been released. Look at that. Was a Juilliard student that graduated in 1964. Did further studies in Germany and further studies in Princeton. 1965, the Baroque Beatles album, which was Beatles songs in the style of, I suppose, mostly Johann Sebastian Bach, but arranged for a string ensemble. And he did all of the arranging, and I suppose quite a bit more connected to that album. So, and then he turned 26 and made a Joplin recording. There should be a question, shouldn't there?
Yeah, where did all that talent go?
How did ragtime enter the picture?
Very good question. As with every good question, the answer is a bit more complicated than one might expect. I became aware of ragtime, I think before I was 10 years old, actually, through the offices of my older brother, who was very keen on early jazz and wanted to play early jazz. He wanted to play the trumpet and the cornet, and he needed somebody to accompany him, to play with. And he had a kid brother who was a piano student, so basically he press-ganged me into playing with him. So in fact, I started playing traditional jazz. Listened a lot. I was thinking of Paolo this morning talking about Jelly Roll Morton. Well, I absorbed everything of Jelly Roll Morton at that time. My brother and I had the good fortune to be taken by our father to jazz clubs in New York City. I imagine these two little kids, you know, sort of wandering into these clubs, but where we could hear and get to know some of the old jazz musicians from New Orleans and Chicago, and they even let me sit in with them at times. Then a bit later we came to know the very important songwriter and music publisher Clarence Williams, who was running a pawn shop in Harlem. and we would visit him maybe once every month, etc. In the course of this, I of course came across Joplin, because you do not know the history of jazz without knowing about Joplin. And I learned Maple Leaf Rag by ear and played it the way a jazz pianist would play it. And I heard a couple of other things, and that was that story. Now, flash forward to my early 20s. I am living around the corner from, and very good friends with, a composer by the name of Eric Saltzman. Now, Eric and I, as I say, knew each other from the modern music scene in New York. And Eric was also a good friend of Bill Balkins. Bill and I had already met while I was at Juilliard. Bill needed someone to do orchestrations of a show he was working on, and reached out to me. Somehow he'd heard about me at Juilliard. I think that's right, his first wife was a fellow student of mine at Juilliard. So I got to know Bill some at that time. And then, the period I'm talking about, this would be late 60s. Eric tells me that he is very excited about Scott Joplin, because Bill had introduced him to Joplin. And I said, oh yes, Joplin, yeah, Scott Joplin, I know this. And then I started looking at the music that Eric had on his piano, and I thought, I don't know this at all. This is something very different from what I imagined. And over the next year or two, I of course became just absolutely taken with his music. And Bill and I would often play together. We often met at parties that Eric had, or played concerts together and so forth. Which answers, I think, one question you were thinking about of Bill's role in all of this. And at the time, I was also working for Nonesuch Records. I'd become, the jug band recorded for Elektra Records, which was the parent label of Nonesuch, was their classical label. And because I was there in-house, I sort of got an inside track into Nonesuch. And I did recordings for them, very obscure things, 15th century French secular songs, 17th century German student songs, etc. And one day, but I had the freedom to record what I wanted as long as it could come in, with a tight budget. And I came to them and I said, I was working at the office. I came into the office one day. I said, look, Scott Joplin is wonderful. We must do a recording of this music. I said, and I can get you the pianist at a good rate. They went along with this. They became convinced by the music very soon. And so we did the first album in the summer of 1970. And it was a very conscious decision to present the music as we did in that and the subsequent Nonesuch recordings. A, on a classical label. B, presented like serious music, with a serious cover, with serious notes. In other words, saying, this is wonderful and important music. And it's not rinky-tink or any of that. There is a lot going on in Scott Joplin. And then, as we did with every recording of Nonesuch in those days, we put it out on the market to die. And
Spoiler, it didn't die.
Yeah, to our surprise and gratification, it didn't. So that brings me into Joplin, and then I was there in Joplin, and I'll just very quickly relate that it basically took over much of my life for the next couple of years. I was playing everywhere and so forth, and at a certain point I felt that I had to withdraw from it publicly. I still loved the music, I really always would, but I stopped playing. I told my managers I wouldn't play any more concerts. I did my last recording, and then for some years I really went cold turkey. And to my great surprise, a while later, I was asked to play again. In fact, to come to London and play Joplin there. And, that was the early 1980s, and it never stopped since then. London not only brought me, you know, a new audience and new acclaim, but also brought me my wife. So I'm very, very grateful to that particular invitation.
Speaking of the original None Such recordings, I wondered, were there any memorable moments in recording that? I mean, you probably could not have foreseen how important those recordings would become as you were making them, and I wonder, what were the circumstances of recording like?
Well, they were, in that respect, much like any other recording. You know, you play your takes, you try to do it well. I was working with a wonderful production team which did most of the non-set recordings in those days. We were recording in a church in Manhattan, and it's interesting, was it you who was talking about timing the music to miss the trains here in Sedona? Well, we were timing it to miss the West Side IRT subway, which ran underneath the church. And this was still tape recordings. We did have Dolby noise suppression, but you still got the train noise, so we had to, you know, to time things very carefully to miss the trains. But from a certain point of view, inevitably, it was just another album. We recorded, we edited, we put it out. We all were committed to the music. But of course, if you make recordings, you don't make a recording without being committed to the music. But everybody was excited by it because this was new to people. Nobody in our world knew this music, and everybody just this is wonderful stuff.
So in January of 1971, the New York Times chief music critic Harold Schoenberg wrote an article called Scholars. Was it Get Serious on Scott Joplin?
Something like that.
And I think it can't be understated how very, very powerful and influential Harold Schoenberg would have been at that time. I suppose I'm curious what the initial reaction was that you had to the review. And I'm also curious if you ever had a chance to meet with Harold Schoenberg later to kind of...
Well, in fact, I knew Harold Schoenberg. He was not quite a friend, but an acquaintance of my father's. So I had met him already through the family tie. I don't remember if I spoke with him about the Joplin per se, but I think I knew it was coming. And as I say, he was familiar. Of course, the New York musical world, like any musical world, is pretty small, you know, for all the size of the city. And everybody knows everybody else. And I was fortunate, even already in my late teens, sort of to be taken into it, to the world particularly of, you know, of user-unfriendly contemporary music. But meet the composers, the critics, and so forth, who were very kind. So in that way, yes, I knew Schoenberg and many. Eric Salzman, whom I mentioned, was at that time also a newspaper critic, and we met at parties after avant-garde concerts and things like that. So.
I'm wondering if, you know, when the Sting came out, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit here, but when the Sting came out and The Entertainer became such a smash hit, I think it made it, I mean, to what was it, number 1 or number 2 on the Billboard pop charts. I mean, alongside rock bands and things of the day, and was played on pop music stations. I mean, it's almost unfathomable today. If you can imagine suddenly Tom Turpin's St. Louis Rag is number 1 on the charts or something. What do you think made the American culture at that time so receptive to this music? And I mean, having been there on the ground at the time as well, just why do you think it became so successful when it did? There had been some recordings of Joplin before. I'm thinking of Ann Charters,
Yes.
who made an album. Of course, there was Naki Parker, who played it more as jazz. But Ann Charters had attempted a sort of classical approach to Joplin that didn't quite take off in the way that yours did. And I wonder what you think about that, or having reflected on it since then.
I did reflect on it even then. I mean, the story with Ann Charters, whom I did not know, I regret to say, was that her recording came out on a label that was not widely distributed and terribly well known, whereas None Such had a strong presence on the record scene, so that made a big difference. Why did it happen then in The Entertainer? Well, I should say about The Entertainer that I learned it, well, no, I had heard a recording of it by a jazz band led by the old New Orleans trumpeter Bunk Johnson in 1948, which is a very interesting recording. But then, that was when I was, sub-adolescent. But then, actually, I was reintroduced to it by Bill Walken. He played it one evening at Eric Salzman's, and the effect on it was absolutely magical. And I will have to say, for the rest of my life, I always was trying somehow, when I played, to recapture what I heard, what I got from Bill. I'm not sure if I've done it yet, but he sort of like set the bar on this piece. Now, I was so taken with it, and all of us were, that I said I wanted, this will be ironic in terms of the studio, I said I wanted that to lead off the first album on None Such. And then the record company said no. Said it's a slowish piece, it's not an up-tempo piece, it can't be, and also it's chronologically not the earliest, and some of you may have noticed the pieces on the album were in chronological sequence. But so I was overruled. But I took a certain ironic pleasure in it becoming such a great success. I might not have liked all the ways it happened, but it showed that the piece really had it in it. Let me say one more thing. Sorry, you raised the question, why this at this time? I mean, why Joplin in general? I think it was a cultural moment that was favorable to it. Maybe in the lead up to the bicentennial in 1976, there was already a heightened interest in American things. Much of it in, I'll have to say, a good way. Not nationalistic, but discovering things, and discovering things that fed into what all of us were connected to. Then also there was a growing interest in black culture, and the music and literature and the whole society and culture. And I think those two things really helped create a receptivity to this music. It sort of addressed various things. There's one other thing which, to me, as a student of avant-garde music, was perhaps less salutary, but and that is that this was music that was new to people, but that was accessible. And of course, I was spending a lot of my life with music that was new to people and was anything but accessible. But the fact that it could be familiar and, in a sense, struck roots with people. I think intuitively people knew where this music was coming from. And it was just, I think, a fortunate moment that it could be received that way.
So, as we're starting to move towards the interpretation, the way you chose to approach Joplin's music, and I know that you had mentioned that seeing it on the page had a really, really strong impact on that. But prior to the conscious decision to record the music of Scott Joplin as faithfully as possible to the notation of Scott Joplin, we're going to digress and come back. I think to many of us in the room here, there are all kinds of wonderful recordings of the music of Scott Joplin, whether it's solo piano or ensemble playing, works, complete or near complete performances by William Albright, John Arpin, Roy Eaton, Scott Kirby, more recently Richard Dowling, and so on. And I think many, if not all of us, look to your recordings as kind of a standard and a place that we start our perspective of how are we playing our Scott Joplin. So you obviously did not have that benefit when who was your idea of standard
Right. Well, that's also a very good question, and of course I am very grateful and honored that some people like yourself who came after had some of my performances as a reference. I hope that you felt you could do it better. I felt myself over the years I could do it better. I hope I learn a thing or two in the intervening time. But it's true, I did not have a tradition to draw on. Basically, all that I heard was the rinky-tink, very fast kind of performances. So I had a sense, but Bill was also playing it as written and at more measured tempos. I saw that even without him, but when we got together and talked and played, we were doing very similar things. I mean, he has his own personality and his own particular kind of articulation and shaping phrases, but there was clearly a common sense of how this music could go. And Bill, of course, is a composer, a distinguished composer. I, at that time, was a composer, and we were looking at this as a composed music. It was not improvised music, it was not even written improvisation. It was carefully composed, and in a sense, the message was on the page. So I basically approached it the way I would any music, be it Bach was a composer I spent a lot of time with, or Brahms, or Stravinsky, or whatever, What is the composer telling us in the notes? And I shaped that, I guess, not quite out of whole cloth, but in many ways, out of what my understanding of music and notation and so forth was. And I did have that jazz background too, although it's not, I know, very present on the surface. There are some people who were not happy about that. But that was also a conscious choice. That it had this impact on people later. I'm always amazed by that, but very grateful for it, and moved that could show a way to some other musicians who could find their own path. And I'm sure nobody plays just like me, which is a very good thing. There are wonderful pianists out there, and they find their own path to this music. That's how it should be with any music.
Right. Well, I want to move things along, and so we have time to open it up for some questions from the audience, so that it's not just us throwing the questions. I think my last question for you, actually, I think there's two. One is more of a request, which is that before we finish, you tell us a little bit about the upcoming Henley edition of Scott Joplin and what that means to his legacy. But before that, I just want to remind folks that you've had such a varied career as a scholar and as a musician. I mean, you are world-renowned for your interpretations of Bach, world-renowned for your scholarship and interpretations of Renaissance music. Actually, my connection, sort of personal connection with Joshua Rifkin is through my own musicology studies, where I was at the University of Pittsburgh with one of his students who became my teacher, Mary Lewis. And through her and reading papers in Renaissance vocal polyphony, reading papers that she wrote, it was very interesting to me because, of course, by that time I was already fascinated by ragtime, knew those recordings, and now I saw this other side of you that previously, as just a ragtime person, I hadn't really seen. So I wonder if you could maybe just speak for a moment about other areas of interest or research projects or just musical performance projects that you've undertaken in the years since Joplin that you are especially proud of, and things that are particularly meaningful to you.
Sure. Gladly, I should say one thing, that actually also Mary Lewis, whom Brian mentioned, had me come and visit Pittsburgh a number of times and do guest seminars, and at several of them I met this very, very sharp student who did, marvelous work in Renaissance seminars, and then discovered that he was also interested in and at playing ragtime. So, now, in a way, I had the usual kind of straight classical education and pursued that, although I suppose not in the, as my career, not in the most regular way. I had the great good fortune to be growing up in New York City at a time when its musical life was particularly lively. And as I mentioned, I had the good fortune to get to know a lot of really great musicians and great scholars. My particular focuses, both as a performer and in research, were, as Brian mentioned, Renaissance music and Bach. And indeed, the success of Joplin opened the path to start recording Bach as well. I was able to say to the label, well, let's go out and do some Bach. And I sold them a few records, and they were very indulgent. Those records also had success. So most of my career since then has been on the classical side, as it were. I recorded, cantatas, B minor mass, stuff like that. Published articles on this and Renaissance music, the normal thing like that. I also was lucky to be able to do a lot more music. I did a lot of 20th century music, some 19th century, etc. As I mentioned, when I had to stop doing Joplin, it's because it threatened to take over my life and get in the way of other things. But I was happy when I could come back to it. Those of you who really are interested, I'm told you, but no, I have seen, I will confess, you can find most of it on Wikipedia. And the last time I looked, it was a pretty accurate article. I, of course, had nothing to do with it out of ethical reasons, but it seemed okay. So if anybody cares to find it out, you can. But let me get to the other thing that Brian mentioned, the Henley edition of Joplin. Now, I don't know how many people here know of the august German music publisher G. Henle, or in German, G. Henle. This is one of the really premier classical music publishers in the world, in Europe, but internationally. Any kid who has, or grown-up musician, who has seriously played the European canon, if they are a violinist, a cellist, or a pianist, will have played from Henley editions. They are gold standard. Now, a couple of years ago, I was approached by Henley. Would I edit for them Scott Joplin? Imagine this publisher saying, we want to bring Joplin into our repertoire. Would I do a critical edition of Joplin, bring the full weight of scholarship to bear on his music? I had actually at the time thought I didn't want to write anything about music anymore or do any more projects in it, but of course you can't say no to this. I owe it. So I've agreed. I met with the editors about a year ago in Germany. We have laid out plans, and I'm about to start a serious work on it. Those of you who have played from Henley editions will know them just from the color of their covers. Now, I'm going to show you one which is not Joplin, but for those of you who can see it, is already signaling a change in their direction or an expansion of their direction. They are publishing exquisite editions of Gershwin. Just wonderful. And they are very excited about doing Joplin. And imagine, Scott Joplin's name on these covers alongside Brahms or Chopin or Mozart. One couldn't wish for anything more. So I'm hoping that in the next 2 or 3 years I'll do the edition. I haven't said this to Brian, but I want to when it's published, I want to come back with it.
So we've covered everything there is to cover, right? We'd like to invite some questions. I know we had 2 microphones.
There's one on that side, so if anybody over here, you could take it to them, Joe. So we have a pair of wireless microphones, one on either side of the stage here, and I think we probably have about 15 to 20 minutes. We can take some Q&A. We don't want to be here until midnight. Well, I don't mind, but I think some of you may want to get a little rest before the fun starts at 9 tomorrow. So maybe if you could have the house lights up just a little bit, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
I'll try to make my answers shorter.
Let's see, is this, okay. Yes. Our first question, I saw a hand go up from right here. This is Leo Roth. He happens to be our first ragtime kid.
Ah.
I'm curious, what was the name of the church you recorded the Joplin pieces at for Nonsuch in New York?
It was called Rutgers Memorial Church. It was at Broadway and 71st Street. It may no longer exist, but it was frequently used as a recording studio despite the problems with the subway.
I think we have one over here.
Did you tour extensively to support sales of that first album, and was there international demand?
Could you say that again? I didn't quite hear it.
Did you tour extensively to support sales of that first album, and was there international demand?
Yes, I was quickly contacted by one of the leading concert agencies in the US to play concerts, and for the next couple of years I toured quite extensively, in fact, which was a wonderful experience, I'll have to say, because, you know, like any New Yorker, you know the Steinberg cartoon, I mean, it was New York and there was the rest of that stuff out there. And although I did not come to Sedalia, I'm sorry to say, I did get to see a lot of this country that I probably would not have come to see otherwise. And it was a very signal experience to me to do so and get a sense of what all is out there.
Professor Rifkin, if I might ask you to revisit the 70s when you recorded those exquisite albums, your beautiful piano playing aside, and I know Leo Roth asked questions about the actual venue, those are among the very finest piano recordings ever made. And what can you tell me about the piano that you recorded on?
Very good question. First of all, when you talk about the quality of the recording, a lot is due to the production team I mentioned. Now I'll give them their proper names. The engineer was a Swiss gentleman named Mark Aubort, A-U-B-O-R-T, and his co-producer was a brilliant pianist herself by the name of Joanna Nikrans, whose daughter, by the way, Erica Nikrans, also became a very eminent pianist. So they were a wonderful team. Mark was really a wonderful engineer with microphones. The church was chosen for its excellent acoustic, and now the piano. This was an instrument that no longer exists. It was a Baldwin SD-10. The Baldwin Piano Company in those days was still a competitor, and the only serious American competitor of Steinway. And I can't remember how it came that we used one of their pianos, but actually I didn't like Steinways very much then. It wasn't until I got to Europe and could play a Hamburg Steinway that I could really love Steinways. But I was very fond of the Baldwin, and that's what we used for all 3 recordings. As I say, Baldwin eventually vanished from the scene, not that long after the last of those recordings was done. But they were an eminent piano maker, and their best instrument, this was their, 9-foot concert grand, they were beautiful instruments. I'm very, very glad that you noticed the quality of that instrument.
In 2020, I was delivering pieces in Colorado, and I was listening to your album. And when Gladiolus came on, I started crying. It was an emotional experience. It was almost spiritual. And I want to know if there's any Scott Joplin pieces that have brought you to tears, or maybe when you were reading the music, or if music in general, or his music, does have an emotional reaction.
Before I played it tonight, I almost said the following about Gladiolus, that when I was practicing it, and in the third strain with that amazing chromatic passage, it virtually brought me to tears, genuinely. So I'm very glad that it had the same meaning for both of us.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes?
We have a question here.
Yeah.
Sir, if I may pose my question. When you offered us the Athena today, you introduced one of the thorniest of Joplin's pieces, where structurally he goes through rather complex chord changes between sections, and often when those are played, they seem to baffle a lot of pianists, and they just, they make it sound like, well, why didn't Joplin just play through to the next section, and why does he stop everything? What was in his mind? How have you figured out what makes that work? Because it worked when you played it, but often when we hear it, it just sounds like Joplin was running out of ideas and just stops the piece and then jumps into a next section. How have you thought about this piece?
Well, first of all, it is rather unusual that every section is in a different key. That's not at all typical. And I guess, it's what has surprised me when I first played the piece. For the rest, I actually can't answer it. I just, every performer, no matter how sort of thoughtful or intellectual some people think we are, really are working from our instinct and our gut. And I just played it as it came. I am grateful that it made it seem convincing to you. I'm afraid I can't really tell you more.
I'm just curious, what was the process of finding all the sheet music? Was it a difficult journey?
Yes, it was, because this was before the publication of the New York Public Library edition. And some of the pieces were available in folios, not very good editions. Vera Brodsky-Lawrence was already at work on the NYPL edition, and Bill had close contact with Vera. So I got some scores through Bill, but it was picking them up from miscellaneous sources, so I didn't have all of Joplin available to me. We pulled it together, just trying to find pieces that A, we could see, and B, that we liked. I'll tell you one story about that, not with the first album, but the second album. I got a package one day at my home from Martin Williams, the great jazz scholar and curator of the jazz collection at the Smithsonian Institution. And he said, I think you might be interested in this. And I opened it up, and it was an unknown piece by Joplin called Solace. But this story gets worse. One of my other colleagues at ragtime was a very gifted composer named Peter Winkler. Peter wrote some beautiful rags that people don't know today. I mean, they have to learn them and play them again and so forth. And to my great shame, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I played the piece through for Peter. I said, don't think it's really top drawer Joplin. Peter, to his credit, disagreed with me violently and it was, right, I was wrong.
Professor Rifkin, firstly, thank you so much for being here and sharing your very inspiring interpretations of the Joplin rags. What I want to ask you is regarding different interpretations of the music. Your approach is certainly quite classical, and there are many, many pianists who have interpreted this music in less of a classical way, more jazz, honky-tonk,
Right.
maybe varying on the repeat of each string or on everything. I'm curious whether you think these different approaches always detract, sometimes add, or are equally valid interpretations.
That's a very good question and a difficult question to answer. You know, everything really depends on how it's done. And sometimes there are different interpretations that are just not interesting or almost seem to work against the music. Then there are others which, on the surface of it, or as you first know of it, might seem absolutely crazy and turn out to be wonderful. Now, it is my belief that Joplin meant these pieces not for a kind of jazz-inflected performance, and really meant them to be played as notated, as written. In fact, myself, earlier, I did used to decorate things and change things on the repeats, and gradually I stopped doing that. And the important thing for me is, well, how do you phrase? How do you shape it? How do you weight these harmonies? I could spend hours on this because it also relates to my work in so-called early music with Bach and so forth. But the fact that, for me, that is, let's say, the basic path into Joplin. And of course, as we saw in discussion, even seeing it that way can lead to many different performances, because every pianist is different. The tempos will be, even if similar, a bit different. The phrases will be shaped differently. Sonorities will be different. But again, even if that were what Joplin imagined or envisioned for his music, well, you know, one of the beauties of music is that no composer has control over a piece after it leaves their hands. And so it has to become the performers. And again, just as much if you are playing all of the notes, and only the notes, but of course I mean by that, trying to figure out what the notes are doing, what they're saying, what the idea behind the notes is. Or if you are improvising, decorating, etc., etc. All of that is possible. I am in many ways a great relativist about these things. I'm less relativist if I'm doing it, because I have to find my way, and the way that convinces me is right, but that should not have any bearing on what anybody else does.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Maybe we'll take one from this side of the audience, one from over there. Do we have any on this side? Of course.
Hello. I'm wondering the African-American reception of ragtime at the height of the album's popularity.
Well, you touch on what for me is a very sore point. You know, how shall I say this? I mentioned this before. Only black musicians could have created this wonderful music. And certainly at the time the first Joplin recordings appeared, for many historical and cultural reasons, there was very little reception of this music among black audiences. It's funny, I was talking with a colleague earlier today who had a similar experience. It's something that befuddled us, that we regret immensely. Of course, it's not for me to say who should respond to this music in what way. But the fact, if I may be very candid, that the reception of this was so overwhelmingly a white phenomenon, is, to me, very regrettable. I think that has changed over the years. I mean, slightly related being that, for example, you had, since the early 21st century, a band like the Carolina Chocolate Drops, which I remember when I heard them, I said, I've been waiting for this. You know, I've been waiting to see this music received by this community and made by this community. So I'm obviously not the most qualified person to talk about this, but it is something that I know I and others missed, and I think it has been a gradual change, and I hope it will change more. Because, my God, any community that had in it somebody who could produce something like this, you know, what to say? Thank you for the question. Was there one other on the other side?
Bill.
I think David Rifkin.
David Rifkin.
Down the front?
Down the front there. Bill, down there.
God, the price is right. Come on down. I want to build on one of the questions that came up in discussion about how you finally, decisively came down to your interpretation as you started to record. Tempo is quite possibly the single most contentious issue in any kind of music, in the history of music, argued over infinitely. How did you decide precisely the metronomic tempos that you finally picked? Was it a matter of what's marked in the scores, or how it feels under the fingers, the effect of certain phrases? What was your process?
Well, it was basically an intuitive process. It's very funny, you mentioned the importance of tempo, and in my work in Bach, I have been obsessive about evidence of tempo, and when I've taught it, I have gone into this matter in great detail with students. Joplin, well, I was a different person then. It was a different time, and it was largely intuitive. As I say, Bill Balcom and I played a lot, and our tempos were similar. I think, at least as we played for each other informally. So in a sense, we already had a kind of sounding image of this music and what its tempo might be. As you know, there are only, I think, 3 metronome markings in Joplin, and 2 of them seem utterly insane. Quarter note equals 100 for, sugarcane, and for pineapple rag. Pineapple rag just about will play at that, but it sounds crazy. Nevertheless, one has to take it seriously, and my tempos have actually moderated or changed over the years. You know, you always are rethinking about things and so forth. But as I say, it was something that almost presented itself to me, both just from reading the music, reading the notorious statement, it is never right to play ragtime fast, which of course, at a certain point, provokes you to say, well, what does fast mean? What does not fast mean, etc. And as I say in my other performance life, that's a question that obsesses me quite a bit. I think I came to the feeling that, well, I had shaped Joplin the way I played it, and I couldn't really do it any other way. It may be totally wrong, for all I know. And it's something I would have to live with if that's the case. But I think that at that time we had a sort of common view of how these pieces might go. I know that Gunther Schuller, about whom we talked a lot, did things quite differently, and so have others. And I can only say I could only hope hope that whatever tempo I played it at or play at today will still make a musical image that sounds convincing to people when they hear it. I could hope that if Joplin were there, he might have said, well, that's sort of something like what I had in mind.
Well, thank you so much, Joshua Rifkin, for being with us tonight. And now, maybe he won't mind if I share this last little bit of trivia. Professor Rifkin never eats before a performance, so he has not yet had dinner. So we will let him get to his dinner. And thank you all for being here tonight and for being part of this program. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at noon and again at 7:30. Until then, have a good night, and we'll see you tomorrow.